people were buying all those old things that I wrote in the 90s and making movies and TV shows about them. And every time one of that happens and I announce it on my website, half the internet goes crazy. Why the f is George R.R. Martin writing this other thing and he should be writing Winds of Winter? What is he doing? What is he doing? And I want to say, I did it in 1993, guys. Come on. It was lying in my drawer and they wanted it, so I sold it to them.
Welcome to the main stage here at the Javits Center, home of New York Comic Con. This very space is where all of the magic happens all weekend long. We are bringing you so many great panels and videos, some of them hosted by me, your video producer and host Ashley Victoria Robinson, and some of them hosted by a slew of amazing talent. If you want to be able to make sure that even though you're not with us or you're catching up at home, you see everything that happened this year in 2025, head over to thepopverse.com. We've got memberships, we've got so much access to all the coolest stuff. In the meantime, sit back and enjoy your feature panel presentation.
George R.R. Martin is the Hugo Award-winning, Nebula Award-winning, Locus, World Fantasy, British Fantasy Award, and Balrog Award-winning internationally best-selling and globally renowned author of the Song of Ice and Fire series, Fever Dream, The Armageddon Rag, and many other novels, and creator and editor of the Wild Card series. Some of his work has been adapted to television. I've heard it's done all right. Television is where he started out, working on shows like Beauty and the Beast and The Twilight Zone. He was also involved in the creation of the Elden Ring computer game. And most importantly, he has been kind enough to join us in conversation today. George R.R. Martin.
Those awards that you mentioned, very traumatic history with some of them here. You know, my Balrog Award, I never received it. They claimed that they were driving it to the post office and they were rear-ended and all the Balrogs for that year was destroyed.
Oh.
And I said, well, you're gonna make a replacement? And the Balrog guy said, no, I'm moving to Iman and you'll never hear from me again. And I never did. And that was the end of the Balrog Awards.
There was one of them. Is it the Nebula or the Hugo that looks like a dildo? I'm sorry. Is this a...
No, it's the British Fantasy Award that looks like a dildo.
Okay. All right.
The Hugo looks like, well, I suppose you could say some Hugos look a little like that, but yeah.
It's a rocket ship, right? So
It
it's
is a rocket
by
ship.
nature. This is exactly the
A
conversation.
silver rocket ships, and the Nebulas is a big hunk of lucite, and et cetera, yeah.
George, I think on the whole, it's best to begin with the question I'm sure most of the people in this room want answered. It's the question that's on so many minds, and I'm hoping, I know everyone is hoping, you can tell us, can the Giants keep winning and putting up these crazy numbers on an offense built around a couple rookies? Don't you think that sooner or later Dart and Scatterbo are going to be
It all depends on whether Jackson Dart is the real thing. Is he the real thing? I don't know. I don't know, but so far so good, you know, but
I mean,
we've had
just
other
kids.
You know, I liked a couple years ago when they had the third stringer came off the bench, and he was like a Jersey kid who lived with his mother.
Yeah.
He lived with his mother, and nobody even thought he'd make the team, and he led them to 3 3 wins in a row, and I thought for a minute, that's it. That's it. This is the perfect story. If I was writing this for a show, yeah, I would write it that way. And the kid who didn't even make the team and lived at home, except it faded, and now he's on some other team. So that's sad.
Sorry, I know you guys don't want us to talk about the Giants. I apologize.
I
know you're.
I'm weird because you know, I'm as you can see, I'm very, very old, really, really, really old. Anybody here? And I grew up in Bayonne, New Jersey, born and raised in Bayonne, New Jersey, and that's like right across that water that you have there. So. The sports, when I was a kid, my father loved sports, and I was a Dodger fan, Brooklyn Dodger fan. Brooklyn Dodger fan. You had to be in New York in those days. There were 3 teams, and you rooted for one, and you hated the other 2. I didn't like those Yankees or Giants or something. I was a Dodger fan. And I was around long enough to 1955. Dodgers finally won. Brooklyn Dodgers won the World Series. And it seemed like the world would be good, but then they went to Los Angeles, and we got the Mets. So, so I've had the Mets. But then I also had the Giants, the football Giants, the New York football Giants, and I rooted for them. But then they started this new league, the AFL, and we had a team called the Titans, who didn't keep to that name long. They became the Jets, and I said, well, I need a team to root for in this league too, because the Giants are losing all the time. These Jets seem pretty good, so I became a Jets fan and a Giants fan, which I gather is forbidden by New York State law. But I don't care. I do it anyway. And of course, the Giants were terrible for that whole period there, but the Jets got this kid, Joe Namath, and he was pretty good. And then the Super Bowl started, and Joe, not everybody knows this, but some people know this. Joe Namath on Super Bowl III went down to the crossroads and met the devil, and made a plan with him to win Super Bowl III on the condition that the Jets would never, ever, ever, ever win anything else again. But I'm hanging out. People are speculating, that am I going to die soon before I finish that? I have said I'm not going to die until I see the Jets and the Giants in a Subway Super Bowl. So I think that means I live forever. So,
okay.
Yes.
So if J.R.R. Tolkien is the grandfather of modern fantasy, I guess that makes you the father of the genre, inspiring a whole generation of great authors like Patrick Rothfuss, Joe Abercrombie, Brando Sando. Did you ever imagine when you wrote the first chapter of Game of Thrones that you were going to be a fucking legend?
No. I of course, I hoped that the books would be popular and would do well. And it's weird with Tolkien because the internet is constantly running these. I'm trying to phrase this in a way that's not obscene, full of fury. George R.R. Martin blasts Tolkien. George R.R. Martin attacks Tolkien. George R.R. Martin, destroys Tolkien.
Owns Tolkien.
Owns Tolkien. Ridiculous. Tolkien is the most influential writer in my life. A lot of writers have influenced me, and I read when I was younger. But you don't. No matter how much you love a writer, you don't want to just duplicate him. That's not creative at all. You want to bring your own stuff to it and your own thoughts. As much as I love Tolkien, I do have things here. So when I say Gandalf should have stayed dead, that's not an attack on Tolkien. That's a discussion of a literary choice. And if J.R. was here on the panel, we could debate it or have a discussion. I'm sure we would. But no, I love Tolkien, and I love many of the other fantasies, although modern fantasy, as it exists today, is really so Tolkien influenced. Not that he invented fantasy. Fantasy goes back to centuries, millennia. Gilgamesh and the Greeks and the Romans and all this stuff.
The Green Knight.
The
Green Knight.
The Green Knight. And in the centuries after that, there were people like Spencer, and there were other people writing fantasies of various types. But Tolkien transformed the genre, and everything since Tolkien has been influenced by him in one way or another, either following his lead or in some cases rejecting his lead and saying, no, I'm going to do it differently. And there are some fantasy writers who have been very, let me say, not fans of Tolkien. Michael Moorcock being perhaps a prominent example of that. So Tolkien is huge, but I liked a lot of the other fantasy too. I mean, even before I discovered Tolkien, I was reading occasional sword and sorcery, as it was called back then, dominated by the ghost of Robert E. Howard and Conan the Barbarian. And those were a lot of fun, especially if you were like a 12-year-old boy, like I was, and there were scantily clad women and giant snakes.
Oh, the covers, the Frazetta covers.
Oh, the Frank Frazetta covers, yes, on the Lancer editions. Howard's works had been out of print for decades, but Lancer came back and published those beautiful editions with the Frazetta covers. And yeah, I love those. And there were other people in that tradition, in the sword and sorcery tradition. I loved Fritz Leiber, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. They were fabulous too. And Jirel of Jory, the sword and sorcery, leading female sword and sorcery practitioner. Jirel of Jory by C.L. Moore, I think. I think that was C.L. Moore.
There was Lee Brackett, who did all the great, but she was more science fiction.
Lee Brackett did, a lot of stuff on Mars and Venus and stuff like that.
I mean, I always thought that the Game of Thrones books, you were just saying, there are decisions Tolkien made that you question, but that you love the work. And I always thought that Game of Thrones was very much in conversation with those earlier works, with Lord of the Rings, and also there's all the stuff about, I'm embarrassed to say I'm blanking on his name, the character Jason Momoa played in the first season who gets wiped out from gangrene. Spoiler, sorry. Isn't
Jason
that
also
Conan?
Played Conan?
Well, that's why they cast him as Conan, because of the role he played in Game of Thrones.
Right, and he's amazing. Jason has taken over the world now. I don't know if any of you have noticed. I'd like that part of the world that Pedro Pascal has not taken over.
Yeah.
So having these roles in Game of Thrones was worked out pretty well.
But so who are the other writers that you think it was Tolkien, it was Robert E. Howard, who else are you sort of, because I feel so much of Game of Thrones is sort of circling back to inspect those earlier fantasies and say, well, maybe it would have been more like this, given the way people given the way people are, given what we know about history.
Well, a lot of people will talk about, someone who's known as a fantasist, as I seem to have become now, being influenced by previous fantasy writers, and most notably Tolkien or Howard or something. But in my case, there's a lot of other influences. First of all, this is the New York City Comic-Con, by the way, as you may notice. And believe it or not, there was a time that it was about comic books. And I was a big comic book fan when I was, in junior high and early high school. I was writing for the early comic fanzines. And I came to the first New York City Comic-Con, 1964.
Wow.
One afternoon in Greenwich Village.
Who were the guests?
Well, the guests, that was interesting. Believe it or not, they couldn't get any of the really well-known writers and editors to come at that thing. We had a few guests who were artists who from the Golden Age, who I didn't really know because by then we were well into the Silver Age. But Stan Lee, he didn't come himself, but he sent his secretary, Fabulous Flo Steinberg, who was always talking about how great Fabulous Flo was, and she showed up and talked to us for a while. But the one who really blew my mind anyway was Steve Ditko. Steve Ditko showed up.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know how many of you are actually comic book fans or if you're just like Game of Thrones fans or things like that, but Steve Ditko, you know, Stan Lee was the editor and writer who created most of the Marvel characters we know today. And he had a whole bullpen of artists. The two most prominent being Jack Kirby, King Kirby, and this guy Steve Ditko, who did the art for Spider-Man and a little later Doctor Strange and of course other things and all that. But I met Ditko at that convention. I had a conversation with him and said, you know, I love your art for Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. Doctor Strange especially. I love Doctor Strange. I love Spider-Man, yeah, but Doctor Strange is my favorite. And Ditko said, yeah, he's my favorite too. So that was cool. And he autographed a manila envelope for me. And then and then he left and never came to another comic book convention again for the rest of his life. So I must have scared him or something like that.
My Steve Ditko story is the editor of my comic Lock and Key, Chris Ryle. Thanks. Chris was like the best man at my wedding, a wonderful guy, and he loves comic books, and he found Steve Ditko's address in Brooklyn or something, and he sent him a letter, because there was no other way to get in touch with him, and said, I'd love to do an artist edition of your early work. And he waited months to hear something back, and eventually he got a letter from Steve Ditko, and he opened it with trembling hands, and in it was a sheet of paper with one sentence scrawled on it: never contact me again. So he was a little bit nicer when you met him. Did I hear somewhere that you actually own a copy of the first appearance of Spider-Man? Is that true, or am I out of my mind there?
Excuse me?
Do you own a copy of the first issue that Spider-Man appeared in, or did I hear? I know you own the first issue that the Fantastic Four appeared in, don't you?
Yes, I have both of them. Spider-Man's first appearance was Amazing Fantasy number 15, which was, Marvel was trying, it was just the beginning of what would later be the Marvel Age. And Marvel, for years, hadn't published any superheroes. They actually, if you trace the history of the company, you go back to the Golden Age, and they were a company called Timely, and they had their own heroes. But all of the superheroes kind of died in the late 40s, early 50s.
Right.
And then you got the era of the crime comics and the horror.
And the horror comics.
Yeah. The only ones who survived continuously from the Golden Age to Silver Age were the major DC heroes, Superman, Batman, and
right.
Wonder Woman. Not even like what I would think of as a second tier. The Flash, Green Lantern, Hawkman. They all went under too. Superman and Batman were gigantic, and Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman was not as gigantic as the others, but she survived continuously because her creator put in a clause in his contract that said, if you ever stop publishing Wonder Woman, I get all the rights back. Well, they were not going to let that. Would that Siegel and Schuster had put that in, they'd have a whole different future. But no, Siegel and Schuster lost Superman. And but then Julie Schwartz started the Silver Age and brought back a different Flash, a different Green Lantern.
He was the famous editor for DC Comics.
Right.
The most important thing to know about Julie Schwartz is he figured out that if you stick a monkey on the cover of a comic, it will increase sales by 50%, but only for one issue. So if the issue following has a monkey on the cover, sales will drop back down. So he was big monkey on the cover.
I didn't know this.
Yeah, huge winner.
I'm learning something about it.
You've had a lot of stuff adapted to comic books, but have you ever written for them?
When I was, again, in junior high and all of that, I was writing, comic fandom was just starting. There were no comic book conventions like this yet, but there were comic fanzines. Science fiction fandom was much older. It went all the way back to the 20s and the 30s. And comic fandom, some of the science fiction fans who were publishing their fanzines also liked comic books. But it was only in the early 60s that comic fandom really started separating out and started having, not just one comic panel at a big science fiction convention, but their own conventions and their own fanzines and all that. And some of those comic fanzines were discussions of comic books, you know, and here's our analysis of Superman versus Batman, that kind of thing. But there were also ones that were basically amateur comic books. Some of the writers, a lot of whom were very young with me. I think it was largely a kids' fandom that was breaking off. A lot of them started writing like Batman stories and stuff and publishing them in their comic books, and they quickly got sued out of existence because you can't really do that kind of thing. But there was fan fiction, comic books like Hero, or which was published out of Texas, or Star-Studded Comics, which was also published out of Texas, and they created their own superheroes who may have seemed eerily familiar, but characters like, you know, like Spider-Man and the Changeling and the Human Eye and so forth, who had followings and all that. So that's where I came in. Now, my problem with being a comic book artist is my inability to draw. But I could write, so I wrote prose stories, text stories as they were called. Do any of you know what a text story is? Any of you old comic fans? No? No? Well,
that's my next question.
Wildcard are prose stories, yeah, but the comic books of the 40s and the 50s, and I think well into the 60s, they would have, depending on the age, some you go back far enough, they're big, thick comic books, they have like 4 stories in them, but they would have a story, maybe 2 stories, you know, the lead character. And in between them, you would notice a 1-page story that was a prose story, a text story, thrown in the middle of the comics. What the fuck were those? Well, those were required to get a second-class mailing permit, because if it was just a comic book with art and all that, they didn't consider it literature. So you couldn't get a second-class mailing permit, and you needed that to fulfill subscriptions. So some of us kids in comic fandom who didn't know that rule thought there was something more esoteric, and you have to, if you're going to do a fake comic book, you have to have a text story in the middle. And I was one of the guys writing the fake text stories.
You know, it's impossible to talk about superheroes and comic books without thinking of the Wild Card series, which is actually where my George R.R. Martin fandom starts, not with Game of Thrones, but with the Wild Card series, which I read as a teenager, and you know, came along in the 90s when suddenly all these creators were reevaluating the comic books of the 60s and 70s through an adult lens. So you had guys like Alan Moore and Grant Morrison and Frank Miller who were doing adult reinterpretations of the superheroes we all fell in love with, and Wild Cards, and it all sort of generated spontaneously at the same time, the way kind of like when it rains, you'll go into your backyard and all of a sudden there's mushrooms everywhere. You know, it just all happens at once. I spoke to the internet about talking to you, and the internet spoke back, and No, it's okay. No, it's okay. Someone said, thank him for Wild Cards, my favorite series of all time. And while I don't need an adaptation, is there progress on the show that was announced? And I do recall there was some discussion for a while of a Wild Card show. Is that still happening?
Well, maybe eventually, but not today. Wild Cards actually is an older series for me than A Song of Ice and Fire. We started, the first Wild Card book came out in 1987, and I think we've had 34 of them by now. And to be clear, although I've written for some of it, my main function in Wild Card has been as the creator and the editor. And it's superheroes in prose, except it's not really superheroes. It's maybe superpowers in clothes, done more realistically and gritty, as you said. There was something in the water then in the mid-late 80s. A Dark Knight, Watchmen by Alan Moore, Wild Cards. They're all variations on the same thing. Like, we'd grown up, we'd read all these superhero stories, and but we could see that we wanted to do something a little more realistic. But we took different paths to it, which is it's interesting.
I mean, certainly the whole Batman thing about losing your parents at a young age, and so then as an adult you go out at night dressed in rubber to be beaten up by strange men in alleys, by enemies, is an odd hobby.
It is a little strange.
You said
When I started really collecting comic books and getting into it in the 50s, Batman was not as big as he later became. I mean, he was an old DC hero, but the 50s version of Batman, if you read him, is sort of silly. I mean, he's
like a square 50s dad.
He's showing up, and Gotham City is full of giant typewriters and other weird architectural thing.
Yeah.
He's always fighting a villain on the keys of a giant typewriter and punching him, and there's no darkness in it whatsoever. The original Batman was a very dark character, as originally created, and he became, again, the Dark Knight, but in between there was the silly Batman period, in which you had the stupid TV show.
I love the TV show.
The one with Adam West?
Yeah, he goes surfing with the Joker. A shark comes up to bite him and he blasts it with shark repellent and stuff. I mean, some people are like, "Oh, Christian Bale's my Batman. Adam West is my Batman." Come on, Christian Bale isn't fit to tie his bat boots.
Holy moly!
Holy moly!
That's actually Captain Marvel, this holy movie. Yeah.
I've also always wondered where he got the giant penny. You ever notice when we're in the Batcave?
Oh, yes, there's always that giant stupid penny in the background, right?
Yeah.
Was there ever a story about that? I don't know.
There must be, right? There has to be something. There is. Someone says there is.
I did like the Batcave. I mean, if I was a superhero, I would want to have a cave full of giant souvenirs from all of my past
your
triumphs.
victories.
That's right, yes. But no, of course, I read comics when I was a little kid, not only Superman and Batman and the other superhero comics, but back in the 50s, the comics, there was a lot more different genres. There were of course, romance comics for the girls. There were the funny animal comics of, Foghorn Leghorn or Sugar and Spice or whatever they were, and you read those when you were a little kid, and you got rid of them. There were hot rod comics. Now, I lived we never owned a car. Never, ever. We lived in the projects. We owned no car. I took buses or walked everywhere. But that always made me want a car. So I remember reading hot rod comics, which were always about teenage kids getting some piece of crap car and fixing it up really cool, and then winning all the races, and the kids were in hot rod comics. That was the genre. And there were westerns and all of these other types of things. And I read those for a long time. But at a certain point, it was Christmas, and a friend of my mother's, an old childhood friend, for Christmas gave me a hardcover book, Half Space Will Travel by Robert A. Heinlein. And I read the book, and then I started reading books. I started buying books, which meant I had less money to buy comics. So I had to cut down on comics. And I also got rid of some of my old early comics. I was stupid back then. Like everybody else, I didn't know these would ever be worth anything. But I got rid of all my comics. And like a year passed, but then I started seeing these Marvel comics. What the hell is this? So who are these four people fighting this giant monster? And one of them looks like a monster himself. What's going on here? And I read the Fantastic Four, and then Spider-Man came along a little later, and then Stan Lee was just inventing these things I swear, no one in such a short period of time, he invented the basic fundament of the Marvel Universe. Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, X-Men, Avengers, Thor, Captain America. Well, Captain America had been, he'd been frozen since World War II. But they thought him out and brought him back. And it's amazing, that whole lineup of things that Lee created in a relatively short period of time, like 1 or 2 years. Yeah.
I want to turn it back to Game of Thrones. The Game of Thrones adaptation changed everything and changed your life forever. And then you know, the series is continuing. There's been spin-off series. HBO is now launching a third spin-off series. It's called A Night of the Seven Kingdoms.
Night of the Seven Kingdoms, Duncan A.
Although I believe it had a different title when it was first published as a novella. What was the title when it was a novella?
The Hedge Knight was the first of the novellas. The Hedge Knight, and then there were two more, The Sworn Sword and The Mystery Knight, and we hope to adapt those too if the first one, Night of the Seven Kingdoms, is successful.
What can you tell us about Night of the Seven Kingdoms, and what's your level of involvement?
Well, I had published a Game of Thrones, and I had a 3-book contract, and I was working on the second volume in the series, which would eventually be published as A Clash of Kings. That was the first indication that there was difficulties ahead, because I had sold a trilogy that would consist of 3 books, A Game of Thrones, and what was the second? It was was it Storm of Swords? No, it was Game of Thrones, A Dance with Dragons, and anyway, there were 3. I was supposed to write a trilogy. And of course, I blew the deadline, as I have a want to do, and I had, you know, a lot of fantasy books then. Fantasy has always been kind of large books. Tolkien said that thing too, and they were about 800 pages in manuscript, I think. And I'm writing Game of Thrones, and I just sail right past 800 pages, 900 pages, 1,000 pages. I'm not even close to the end. Oh God, I can't finish this in time. And yes, I finished this character and this character and this character, but I haven't even started this character or that character. So at that point, I said, yeah, my trilogy will be 4 books, and.
What did Douglas Adams say about Hitchhikers? He said the increasingly misnamed Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy trilogy. It was like the 6th book or something.
Yeah, Gene Wolfe, a genius fantasist who I was in some writers' workshops with when we both lived in Chicago, he had his trilogy that we were reading in a writers' workshop, and it just became 4 volumes, and he didn't blink, and no one else blinked, so I do it too. Anyway, so. I rearranged my plans, and I moved some stuff that was going to be in Game of Thrones into A Clash of Kings, and I'm writing now A Clash of Kings, which wasn't part of the original deal, and of course I'm running late on it, and as I had a want to do. And Robert Silverberg, I'm sure many of you know Robert Silverberg. He's one of the great science fiction writers. Grandmaster from SFWA, been writing since the 50s. He was the youngest guy ever to win a Hugo. I think he won a Hugo for Best New Writer when he was 18 years old. Pretty damn impressive. But also a great editor. He had done the New Dimensions series. He had edited for Science Fiction Writers America. He edited one of their Hall of Fame books and all stuff. And he had sold an anthology idea. He had edited original anthologies before with the New Dimensions line, but this was going to be a epic fantasy thing, and he contacted 10 gigantic best-selling writers of epic fantasy, and they were all going to write original stories set in their particular universes, because one of the things about epic fantasy is that world building is very essential. You know, you're not just writing a story. You know, Tolkien created Middle-earth, and you know he wrote a number of stories set there, and other people have done that and created even more stories. Yeah. So the 10 writers were invited, and Silverberg got a very nice advance for that. You know, I don't know how many of you know how publishing works, but like an anthology, you sell a book, you get an advance, and you pay the writers from that, and what you don't give to the writers, you get to keep for yourself. And so Silverberg invited me to be in it. Now, that was number one, I was very happy with that because I had an enormous amount of respect for Silverberg and the books he edited. He was a great editor. He never published third-rate material, always good stuff. And so being included in this with these other people. But, you know, I think I said a minute ago that he included in this 10 huge best-selling writers. Actually, he included 9 huge best-selling writers and me. And I was, you know, I was not unknown. I was not a kid off the street. I had won Hugos. I had won Nebulas. I had lost Hugos and lost Nebulas. And I'd published predominantly in the 70s a few fantasy stories, but mostly science fiction stories, occasionally horror stories. You know, there was this period where horror was very, very hot. It had to do with some guy from Maine, and his books were like huge, and then everybody else was trying to write his books, and you could enter a bookstore, and it was all paperbacks with black covers and dripping blood lettering.
Yeah.
So I had one of those, but so I said, sure, I'd be glad to do an anthology. Now I hadn't even finished the second book in the series. So now that I'm in this book and I have to deliver a novella to be in this book with the 9 very prominent writers, it was like, well, what the hell am I going to write about? It has to be a Westeros book, but it can't be a sequel because I haven't finished the main story yet. I can't write what's happening to Jon Snow or Tyrion or Dany or anybody after the series. I got several more books to write in the series. I don't want to give it away, so it has to be a prequel. But that's fine because in my head I had a lot of stuff about Targaryen history, some half formed, some pretty definitely formed. So I looked at all of the eras that I had sort of roughed out, and I picked the era that the Dunk and Egg stories are in, and I wanted to tell. You know, if you're publishing stories, you're going to get reviews. Not so much in those days as it is now, when there's all these annoying people on the internet. But you would get reviews, and you'd read them, and or you wouldn't read them. You know, I have a number of friends, other writers, who say, I never, ever, ever read my reviews. I consider those liars.
Liars.
I don't believe that for a fucking minute. But but one of the things that one of the reviews had said about my books, a generally positive review, is look, here's another fantasy about kings and wizards and lords and knights, and they're fighting for a throne. And it's pretty well done, but we don't need any more of these things, do we? Nobody ever writes about the small people, the small folk, as I call them, the peasants. I said, yeah, that's kind of true. Maybe I should do a story, this prequel, I should do a story about a guy who's not a lord or not a king, and he's not anyone's bastard son. He's just a guy growing up and wondering where his next meal is going to come from. And so somehow the characters of Dunk and Egg came to me, and I started writing the story that became the hedge knight, which is a term I'd used before, you know, for a knight who was just... There were always hedge wizards and hedge doctors in real medieval history, and hedge knight was just a step on that. What happened though is I'm writing this story, and as I always do, I'm struggling with it, and I'm late. And Silverberg has a deadline at the end of the year, and we're in like September or something, and he sends me an email saying, I hear that you're way behind on your book. You couldn't fit the whole one in, and you had to do another book, and now you're late on that one. I can't. This anthology got a really big advance, and the publisher is very serious about wanting it in by the last day of the year. I cannot be late, because then they'll take some money away or something like that. So I'm going to have to drop you from the series. because I hear you're running late. And that was very traumatic. So, but instead of just meekly saying, oh, okay, I'm sorry, I looked at my contract, which we'd already signed. I said, wait a minute. You can drop me from the book if I'm late, but I'm not late yet. So you can't drop me from the book. Or if you did, you'd have to pay me all this money. So I insisted that I remain in the book, and I continued to write The Hedge Knight. Silverberg had actually already replaced me. I don't know with who, but that's why if you look at Legends 1, which was the book that finally came out, it has 11 stories in it, not 10. So some guy who came off the bench and wrote a story. But I got in The Hedge Knight. I finished it like barely in time. That week between Christmas and New Year's, I was going fucking crazy. But I got the story to him on the last day of the year, barely meeting the deadline. The interesting thing about that is like 2-3 other writers also got their stories done on the last day of the year. So I may have been the one that they were worried about, but I wasn't the only one who was doing that. But Legends 1, or just Legends, was, I think, an amazing book. And not only did it have The Hedge Knight in it, but it had an original Robert Jordan story. It had an original Anne McCaffrey story about dragons. It had original stories by, a number of the great great fantasy writers of the age, all set in their established universe. And it had a couple stories by this Stephen King guy. I'm not sure how he got into that book, but
Yeah, I read a couple of his books, and I've always wondered what happened to him. It seemed like things were going so well, such a promising future.
I know. It's it was quite. Anne McCaffrey was. Did any of you read any of Annie's books? Annie was a very talented writer. She was the first woman to win a Hugo for fiction, and I think a Nebula too. She sold her dragon books to John W. Campbell initially for.
In a way, she set the stage for Iron Flame and all the dragon books of sort of, that have been so successful in just the last couple of years.
And Annie's books sold very, very well. She was a best-selling writer, but she moved to Dublin, I think, and lived the rest of her life there. She always was trying to get the rest of us all to move to Ireland because we were tempted.
Why didn't we listen to her?
Ireland had no income tax on writers. Whoa! Why didn't we all move there?
They also created a universal basic income for artists. That's actually a thing that they have there, which is crazy.
But Anne's first dragon story was Weir Search, which John W. Campbell published in Astounding. And that's a science fiction magazine. So, and her dragons, they're dragons, but they're telepathically connected with their riders, and they live on another planet, far, far distant planet in another corner of the galaxy. So Anne would always say for years, I don't write fantasy, I write science fiction. I'm a science fiction writer. These are science fiction stories. Until Silverberg sold that Legends anthology, and it was paying such a big advance. Then I said, here's a fantasy story from me.
But we were talking.
She was in the book.
We were talking yesterday, and we were talking about world building. And one of the things, because Tolkien talked about the secondary world, a world so big, in Lord of the Rings, that you're always seeing glimpses of its history and places we haven't visited in the story. You feel this tremendous depth to that world. And you've always tried for the same thing. But what's interesting, you were talking about yesterday, is that you read so much science fiction as a young guy, and so you keep getting tripped up by questions of science. You did the great vampire novel Fever Dream. You said to me, well, what about this thing about vampires not seeing themselves in the mirror? How would that even be possible?
Yeah.
Knowing what we know about physics.
Right. Yeah, a lot of these legends, these old stories, don't hold up since, and I had enough of a science fiction sensibility that I tried in someone like Fever Dream to justify that.
So is Game of Thrones secretly science fiction? Secretly?
It's secretly a little historical fiction. That was
Right.
the other thing that I was heavily influenced by, not only Stan Lee and the comic books and Tolkien and fantasy, but the historical fiction of the day. I read Ivanhoe, and I read the works of Thomas B. Costain, a very big best-selling historical fiction writer of the 50s, and Nigel Tranter, the amazing Scottish historical fiction writer who just died, I'm about to say a few years ago. It was probably a decade or not. But he kept writing books right until his 90s. Well into his 90s, he was turning out another Scottish historical fiction things, all of which, if you know Scottish history, it's really depressing. And all the stories seem to start the same way. The king was a small boy, and the lords were quarreling. And yeah, it was pretty cool. Maurice Druon, also The Accursed Kings, the amazing French series of historical fiction. And I like the grittiness of historical fiction. So I said, well, let me see if I can combine some of Tolkien's things with some of the real grittiness and hard edge of the best historical fiction.
We're starting to run out of time, so we're going to move slightly into a speed round.
Oh my God!
But maybe
I'm sorry,
maybe the
I'm
last
wordy.
maybe the last pre-speed round question. This is another one from the internet, and I actually thought it was a really sort of touching question. This person asked if you've ever felt like a failure or ever has imposter syndrome, and you've been so successful. That's sort of a weird thought. But then I think.
No, not
But
at
isn't
all.
that all of us?
Not at all. No, I sometimes I'm called to speak to a writers' conference or a group of young writers. How many of you here are aspiring writers? Let's have a show of hands.
Yeah, so a few.
Yeah, a few, not too many.
You're doomed.
I feel very sorry for you. But when I talk to young writers, I tell them, this is not a profession if you are someone who needs security. If you need, financial security and would like to own a house and a car and things like that and occasionally eat, there are other professions. You can be a real estate broker or an insurance agent or a fireman. I mean, there are lots of things, but writing fiction is not only a gamble, but it's a repeated gamble. Now, my career has crashed and burned twice. I started selling my stories in the early 70s, and I got recognized pretty quickly. It was nice, I was nominated for the Campbell Award for the Best New Writer the first year it was given. I lost, but I was nominated. That's pretty good. And then the next year, I was nominated one of my short stories for the Hugo and Nebula, big prestigious award. I lost both of those, but still, it was pretty cool. So I was one of a group of the hot young writers who broke in the late 60s, early 70s. And for a long time, I just wrote short stories because novels were too intimidating for me. They were long. But I finally, after selling my first story in 71, around 76, I started writing my first novel. I will point out, by the way, because, I know there's all this controversy and stuff about Winds of Winter and how late it is, but I've always had trouble with deadlines. And I don't feel happy breaching contracts or missing a deadline or anything like that. So all the other young writers of my class, my generation, the way you did it in those days is you wrote chapters, usually 2 or 3 chapters, and an outline for the rest of the book. And then you sent it around to the publishers. And somebody bought it, and then you had a deadline. You had to finish and deliver the entire book by such a thing. And I said, I hate doing outlines, and I'm not great with deadlines. So I just wrote my first novel, which was Dying at Light. I wrote that. Nobody knew I was writing it. I was locked up, just as I produced short stories. And then one day I called up my agent, Kirby McCauley, who was the same agent I shared with.
My dad's agent
Yeah.
for many years.
And I said, look, I wrote a novel. Here, go sell it. And he did. He did. And not only did he sell it, he was an amazing, innovative agent. He came out of Minnesota, and he came to New York City, and he made up the new rule. He didn't like some of the rules of how an agent was supposed to function. He did things his own way, and amazing work. But I sold Dying at a Light for what was a lot more money than I thought I could possibly get like 3 years before, because there'd been a movie called Star Wars. You may have heard of it, and suddenly science fiction was hot, and they were giving money to new writers who hadn't even had a book before. And then Lisa Tuttle and I wrote Windhaven a few years later, and that got even more acclaim and money. And then I wrote Fever Dream, which was my vampire steamboat novel. That was my, it had a black cover and dripping blood letter. Yeah.
Yep.
And then, and that got even more, And then I wrote a book called The Armageddon Rag. I was trying to do different things. I didn't want to just, be one of the writers who wrote the same thing over and over again. So The Armageddon Rag was a rock and roll novel, part fantasy, part horror, part just a novel about the 60s and the 80s. And that sold for a six-figure advance. First time I'd gotten that, and there was a lot of, this is it, George. This is your bestseller book. This book is going to be a huge bestseller, and you're going to become not just a science fiction writer, you're going to become famous, yada, yada, yada. Well, the problem with the Armageddon, I was nominated for the World Fantasy Award, lost. It was nominated for some other awards. It got some great reviews, and nobody bought it. So the thing about Hollywood, and it is to a certain extent it's true in books too, and it's true actually more now in whatever the hell year this is than it was back then. But you're only as hot as your latest hotness. And suddenly I was not a hot young writer. I was someone they thought was a hot young writer, but now he was older and he'd had this book that was a giant flop. And I couldn't sell my next book. I had written all those other books kind of the same way I wrote Dying in Light. I wrote the book and then Kirby sold it. I wrote the book, Kirby sold it. Now I had actually started another book, and I said, oh, fuck, I need money, and, I'd done some stupid things with the money I got for Armageddon Rag. I'd bought a house and a new car, and, having...
Wasteful.
I made the mistake of thinking, oh, look, it took me a year to write this book, and here's what I got for it, so I make that much money in a year. No. So I couldn't sell that book. So that was a pretty bad period here. At one point, I thought we were going to lose our house, and I was getting more credit cards. I had good credit, so I could always get credit cards. But then the debt gets higher and higher in credit. Oh, this is not good here. This is not good. But fortunately, at the same time, I got an invitation to work for television from a guy named Phil DeGuerre, who actually was a rock and roll guy who loved Armageddon Rag. He had optioned it, wanted to make a movie of it. Movie never made. But then a few years later, Phil revived The Twilight Zone. He said, you want to do a script? And I said, yeah. I don't know how to do a script. I've never seen a script. But I have watched television. He said, scripts are easy. I'll send you a box of scripts, and you can do it. And so I did. And I wound up writing 5 episodes of The Twilight Zone in the mid-'80s. And
Did someone send you a sample script so you know what the format
Phil
was
sent
like?
me a box of sample scripts. And they were easy. Screenwriters won't like hearing this, but, it's easier. It's easier. It is. What's not easier is the business. The writing is easier, but the business is, you don't have one editor, you have 47. They're all giving you notes and things like that. So I worked for Twilight Zone for the remainder of the show, and then I did a little work for Max Headroom, and then I did 3 years on Beauty and the Beast with Linda Hamilton and Ron Perlman. So I had like 5 years where I was writing, television largely, and at the end of that, you climb a ladder in television. In those days, you would usually start with a freelance script, not so much anymore. But then you get on staff, and when you start, your title is staff writer, usually. That's the lowest title, and you know that it's the lowest because it's the only one that has writer in it. And then when you get promoted, you're a story editor, executive story editor, co-producer, producer, executive producer, or co-executive producer, supervising. You climb the ladder, and at a certain point, you're high enough on the ladder that you move into development, which is where you're creating movies and writing, pitching and writing your own shows. And I came out of Beauty and the Beast, and I was in development for 5 years. I did a number of feature film scripts that you've never seen, and I created a number of shows that you've never seen. And at the end of 5 years, I'd made a lot of money because they pay you very well in television. Every time you get one of those promotions, you get more money. But I was tired of nothing actually being made. I said, what? Yes, but I don't want to write for 4 guys in a room. And I want people to know these characters and these worlds and these stories, because I do fall in love with them. So I went back to prose, and I wrote that. But that was kind of my second failure. It's like, okay, my novel writing thing crashed with Armageddon Rag, and then the TV film thing reached a certain level, but I couldn't seem to get beyond that level. I couldn't seem to get my own show on the air. Now, of course, the weird thing that's happening is people are buying all those old things that I wrote in the 90s and making movies and TV shows about them. And every time one of that happens and I announce it on my website, half the internet goes crazy. Why the fuck is George R.R. Martin writing this other thing, and he should be writing Winds of Winter? What is he doing? What is he doing? And I want to say, I did it in 1993, guys. Come on. It was lying in my drawer, and they wanted it, so I sold it to them. But there it is. And the truth is, you asked about wild cards. I had a post a month or so ago about this where I just got, yes, I do love Winds of Winter. I haven't lost interest in it. I'm still working on it. But honestly, I love these other things too. I don't have any kids. I don't know, some of you probably have kids, right? Maybe you have more than one kid. Do you like them all equally? But no, maybe not. But you like them all, right? You like Johnny and Freddie and Susie, and okay, maybe some of them become cokeheads and mass murderers. But most of them are you still love them. And I love wild cards, and the characters I created for it, but the editing work I did as well. And some of the other writers that I got to work with, Roger Zelazny, who was like a mentor of mine, and people like Melinda Snodgrass and Vic Milan and Walter John Williams, John Miller. We had, by the end, today we had 40 different people who wrote for Wild Cards, created characters, and I got to, edit some of them and shape that universe. I like the universe. And but there's the other universe. There's this whole world building thing. World building is big here. Are you? Are all of your stories in one universe, or do you have many different universes?
Well, I guess they're all in the same universe except for I wrote a book called The Fireman where I ended the world. So.
Oh, yeah.
So that's sort of a different universe because then it would be all over for all my other characters. But
right.
We're just about out of time.
How did that happen?
I know, time flies.
How'd you get on Dark Winds?
Dark Winds?
Yeah, how'd you get on Dark
with which you created, with which you helped sort of executive produce with Robert Redford.
Yes, I did. Well, Tony Hillerman, who wrote the Joe Leoporn books, was a friend of mine. In 1979, when I first moved to New Mexico, out of the Midwest where I'd lived at the time, the only person I really knew in Santa Fe was Roger Zelazny, fantastic writer. And Roger told me that there was a First Friday meeting that this guy, Tony Hillerman, mystery writer, had organized. And on the first Friday of every month, all the writers came to the Albuquerque Press Club, where we had a lunch together, and we sat around and talked. And, you know, it was a lunch, but we would still be there at dinner time, usually, where writers can talk a lot. And I got to know Tony Hillerman, and I started reading some of his books, the Joe Leoporn series, which was amazing. And Tony was a great guy. He had organized this thing, and we had, you know, there were mystery writers there and science fiction, fantasy writers, but there were also like romance writers, nonfiction writers, crime, thriller writers. Every kind of writer in New Mexico was there, and talking about it. That was great. And Tony in particular was amazing. Do you know? Have you read the Joe Leoporn books? They're terrific books. Tony wrote 4 Joe Leoporn novels, and they were all successful, and they were getting more and more successful. They were bestsellers, you know. Joe Leoporn is a Navajo policeman, early 70s on the Navajo reservation, solving murders and all that. It was fantastic world, fantastic character. And his agent sold the film rights, television film rights, which Tony was, of course, happy for. All us writers are happy when you give us a big check to, you know, do that. And then Tony sat down to write the 5th Joe Leoporn book. And the studio said, no. We own Joe Leoporn now. See, we paid you for him. We don't want anything else written about him. We own all of the Joe Leoporn now. We own these 4 books. And needless to say, Tony was pretty fucking pissed off to discover that they were not just going to make movies of the existing books, but they thought they owned the character now. And they did own the character now. So the first thing he did was fire his agent. And then he said, well, what can I do now? They own Joe Leoporn, but they don't own the Navajo. So he created a character called Jim Chi, who was a younger guy, also a cop on the Navajo reservation. And he wrote like 3 or 4 Jim Chi books, and those were also very successful. And then the studio never got the movie made, so the rights reverted to him. And now he had both of them. So there were like 4 Joe Leoporn books, 4 Jim Chi books, and then with volume 8, both of them would get together, solve the case, and those were even more successful. Robert Redford was a big fan of Tony Hillerman's and his books. And he purchased rights after the original people had collapsed. And he produced a Joe Leoporn feature film, which he hoped to release to theaters and start a whole, you know, James Bond-like thing. But unfortunately, it didn't turn out as well as he had hoped. So he couldn't get a distributor. He couldn't get a theatrical release. They wound up doing that one direct-to-video. And then he sold 3 more of the Leoporn books to PBS, and it was made for television movies. So there were, those turned out better. Those had Wes Studi as Joe Leoporn, and that was, he was quite good in those. But then that deal went away and died here. So I heard, it must have been, God, what year was it? It was maybe 2005 or something like that. I was contacted by Robert Redford's people, and also Chris Eyre, who had directed several of these things and was probably the leading Native American director in the country, who had won the Sundance, gotten to know Redford at the Sundance Film Festival with a thing called Smoke Signals. And they invited me to lunch, and when the Sundance kid invites you to lunch, you go to lunch. And I had an overall deal with HBO, and actually so did Redford. And they said, I hear you knew Tony. Tony had passed away. But we have the rights to this, but we'd like to get it going as a TV series. Can you have it in at HBO? Can you help us sell this to HBO? So I sat down with Redford and Chris, and we interviewed a lot of potential screenwriters, and we put together a package for the show that would be Dark Winds, and then we went in and pitched it to HBO, and HBO bought it, and we continued to develop it and work it and then film it. But HBO did not pick it up to series, to our disappointment. I think what they thought was it was too similar to True Detective, a series that they'd had. But they gave us the rights back, so now we had the rights back again. And Bob Redford, the Sundance Kid, he had the Sundance Network. So we thought they might like it, and they did. So that's how it wound up on AMC. And we're now, we filmed 4 seasons, and it keeps getting bigger and bigger and better. 100% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, which was quite a thrill. And we have such an amazing cast of people. The actors, Zahn McClarnon and Jessica and Kiowa. And it's a great show. And I'm glad I could do my little bit of opening doors and being part of it and reviewing some of the scripts and all that. But I'm not involved in that. I did, however, have my cameo just a few months ago. They said, let's put you and Bob in the jail cells and do a cameo with you. So I got to be in a scene with Robert Redford. So that's pretty amazing.
George, I want to...
And I got to say, Redford was fucking amazing. It was an honor just to meet him and his wife, Billy. I mean, you look at his films, and he was such a great actor. And he made it look effortless, but it wasn't effortless. And he did quite a range of things. He did thrillers, he did comedies, he did all sorts of stuff. And he founded the Sundance Film Festival, which is probably one of the best film festivals in that. And he was very instrumental in environmental stuff and all of these things that he did. I mean, Bob left such an imprint on the world. He left the world a better place than he found it. Not only films and television, but everything he touched.
George, we're over our time. I just wanted to thank you for letting me be a cameo in your Comic-Con experience. I want to thank everyone else for showing up and supporting. This was a great time. Thank you, George.
You're welcome.